Man loses everything and ends up on the street, but his life changes when he finds a ginger cat. Today, we'll be talking about a movie called A Street Cat Named Bob, which is based on the book of the same name and on real events. James is a street musician who tries to earn his living by playing the guitar and singing. He has nowhere to live and even sleep. He's often forced to look for food in the trash. Passers-by shun him as they see him as an ordinary tramp, except for the fact that he carries a guitar everywhere. But that's not James's biggest problem. The man used to suffer from a severe drug addiction, but he's clean now and isn't planning to go back to the old ways. James wants to start a new life, but he's all alone with his problems. Relatives had long stopped talking to him because of his difficult past. One day, while James is looking for a place to sleep yet again, his former friend Boz invites him to get into the car and relax a bit. James tries to resist at first, but he gives in eventually. He doesn't know that the car belongs to someone else, and the next morning, they get discovered by the car's owner. Boz manages to escape, but James can't be woken up. He had an overdose. James wakes up in the hospital. His attending physician, Val, tells him that he nearly died, and in addition to intoxication, James is also diagnosed with hepatitis. He makes a promise to Val that he's going to stay clean and goes back to living on the street. Meanwhile, Val meets up with her friend, who's a social worker. She asks her to help James out with a placement despite his shady past. Val knows that James has a good heart and believes in him, so James gets social housing. Val makes sure he's all right and gets ready to leave. James thanks her from the bottom of his heart because lately Val had become his closest friend. Left alone, James rejoices like a child. After all, he had already forgotten what it was like to have hot water and a warm bed. However, as James is taking a bath before going to bed, he hears strange sounds in the kitchen and decides that he's being robbed. But it turns out that it's just a big ginger cat that got inside through the window. The cat's behaving like it owns the place and is already enjoying dry cereal, which it turned over from the shelf. James pours the cat some milk. James thinks that the cat must have gotten lost and decides to look for its owners in the morning. The cat stays with him for the night, and while James sleeps, it gets in bed with him, purring. The next morning, James asks around the neighborhood if anyone had lost the ginger cat, but he never manages to find the owners. Convinced that someone must be looking for the pet, James lets it go. During the day, he continues to play the guitar on the street, and at some point, he sees his father with his new wife. James tries to talk to him and offers to spend Christmas together, but his father brushes him off with some money. At parting, he says that they could meet some other time, maybe on New Year's. Back home, James sees the cat at his door, but now it's wounded. He notices a strange neighbor who walks her dogs every day and asks if she knows the owners of the cat. The neighbor's name is Betty, and she invites James into her home and offers her help. She gives James a business card of a vet clinic where the vet could give a free consultation and maybe even help with treatment. Betty says the cat wants to be called Bob. It also turns out that the woman has a severe allergy to animals. James thanks her for the help and takes Bob to the clinic, where there is a huge line. They end up spending the whole day in line, but eventually Bob gets help, even though James has to spend his last money on meds and misses his appointment with Val. At home, he tries to give Bob its medicine for a long time, but is unsuccessful. Then Betty comes to his aid again. She quickly gets it done. James and Betty have a heart-to-heart. James says that his parents divorced a long time ago and that he lived with his mother for a while, but his father never visited him. As an adult, James traveled all over the world. He wants to admit to his addiction, but doesn't have the courage. The next morning, he goes to see Val, who is unhappy that he missed their appointment. James tells her about the cat and about meeting Betty. Val worries about him because she's afraid that James will get too emotional and have another relapse. James takes the cat to the vet again, where Bob gets all the necessary treatments. James thinks about finding a good home for Bob, someone who could take good care of it. But while Bob lives with him, James begins to feel like he has a real friend. He doesn't feel so alone anymore. One day, Bob follows James as he takes his guitar and goes out to play. Bob even manages to sneak on the bus, so James has to take the cat along. The rest of the passengers are delighted with the big ginger cat. When James is walking down the street, Bob climbs on his back, and all the people on the street turn to look at them and smile. Some of them even ask to take pictures with them. People are fascinated by Bob. This time, James manages to gather a huge crowd. People enjoy his songs, and Bob stays by his side, attracting even more attention. James and Bob manage to make a lot of money. An elderly woman comes up to them after the performance and shares stories about her ginger cat that had passed away. She loved him very much and misses him greatly. Boz watches it all. James's life begins to improve. He has dinner with Bob. He always talks to his new friend. One day, Boz catches up to James when he's on his way to perform with Bob once again. Boz is going through withdrawal and looks terrible. He asks James for money, and James gives him some, but makes him promise that he would only spend it on food. He also asks his former friend to not bother him anymore. Christmas is coming. After the performance, the same elderly woman gives Bob some canned cat food and a striped knitted scarf. Upon returning home, James meets Betty, and they agree to have dinner together at her place. The next day, James goes to the supermarket with Bob. The cat sits on his shoulders, as usual, and doesn't seem the least bit afraid of people. James thinks about Betty all the time and decides to buy her a bouquet of flowers. But as they're walking home, James sees Boz on the road. He's unconscious. James tries to get him to come to his senses. Betty runs to his aid. Doctors arrive soon, and Boz is taken away in an ambulance, but he has no pulse at the time. Back home, an honest conversation happens between Betty and James. Betty admits that her beloved brother suffered from addiction and died in this house at the age of 28. He was an excellent artist, and his paintings are hung everywhere in the house. At his next appointment, James tells Val that he's ready to go off medication, but she insists that he needs to continue taking it. James says that his former friend Boz recently died of an overdose, and he doesn't want to end up like him. James spends Christmas with Bob and Betty. They exchange gifts and have fun. Later, in the park, James tells Betty that he wants to visit his father on New Year's Eve, although he understands that he wouldn't be happy to see him. Plucking up his courage, James goes to his father's place. He takes Bob with him. Before entering, James looks through the window at his father's life with his new family. From the outside, their life and home seem perfect, but when his father opens the door for him, it immediately becomes clear that he wasn't expecting James. His father's new wife, Hillary, is especially displeased to have James around, so they ask him to leave, explaining that they're expecting company. However, before James and Bob leave, the cat, frightened by the children, manages to make a real mess of the house. James and Bob leave the house sad and frustrated. James feels miserable because his own father turned him away. James and Bob continue to perform together. People begin to recognize them on the streets and treat them with great warmth. But one bastard sets a dog on them, and James does everything in his power to protect Bob. Other people come to the cat's aid too. An argument begins, the police intervene, and although James isn't to blame in this situation, he still gets banned from performing for 6 months. On top of everything, Betty sees James buying heavy drugs in a pharmacy. He needs them to relieve withdrawal symptoms. James tries to talk to her, but she doesn't want to listen. Even though James can no longer earn a living by playing his guitar, he doesn't give up and finds a job. He's now selling magazines on the street. His loyal friend Bob continues to sit on his shoulder so people come up to take pictures and buy magazines. One day, James and Bob get approached by a man who introduces himself as a journalist, saying that he wants to write an article about them. Unfortunately, some of James's colleagues feel jealous and tell their employer that James is supposedly selling magazines on their territory, taking their clients. The claim gets James suspended for a month, so he's back to having no money. He tries to talk to Betty once again, but she's still very upset. James and Bob have nothing to eat, so they try going to soup kitchens. James ends up performing in less crowded places, but Betty spots him anyway and yells at him because James could get arrested for it. He tries to have a conversation with Betty, but she leaves. Nevertheless, Betty is very worried about James, but she simply can't accept the fact that he'd been struggling with addiction for years because that's what killed their brother. An exception is made for James, and he's allowed to go back to work. So he continues to sell magazines with Bob, attracting crowds of people. Once, they are approached by a woman with a child. She offers to buy the cat, but James replies that he won't sell his friend. They start arguing, and in the meantime, Bob gets chased by a dog. James runs after him, but soon loses sight of the cat. He searches for him until nightfall, but has to return home alone. James can't sleep because he's so worried about his friend. At the next appointment with Val, James is very agitated. It's been 2 days, and he still can't find Bob. James is afraid that something could have happened to him. He can't eat, can't sleep, and he can't play the guitar because he's lost his best friend in the entire universe. The next scene shows a woman from a publishing house talking to a colleague about a video on the internet that has millions of views. The video features Bob and James. The woman says that this story could be turned into a book. Meanwhile, James can't come to terms with Bob's absence and blames himself for Bob getting lost. He's on the verge of relapsing again, but he stops himself at the last moment, and when he goes back home, he sees that Bob has come back through the half-open window. James begins to cry with happiness and hugs and kisses his cat. Soon, he tells Val that he's ready to give up all the drugs. Val explains that it will be very difficult, but James is ready for this step. Before going cold turkey, he tells Betty everything through the closed door, and when he's about to leave, Betty comes out to him. She forgives him and promises to bring him food for the next couple of days, as he won't be able to leave home himself. James suffers from withdrawal symptoms the following days, but gets through it thanks to Bob. Now he's completely off drugs. At the next appointment, Val tells him how proud she is, and James doesn't know how to thank her. After all, Val is the only person who once believed in him and gave him a chance. James's life is getting better, and Betty is planning on going home to her parents because she feels that she's living her brother's life now and not her own. Before leaving, she gives James a small gift to remember her by, and her new address and phone number. She also gives him a letter left by a literary agent who came by when James wasn't home. James goes to meet the literary agent. Turns out that he wants to write a book about Bob. Before starting to work on the book, James decides to go see his father. He tells his dad that he's done with drugs, and they apologize to each other. After that, the book writing process begins. A huge crowd attends the launch of James and Bob's book. Betty, Val, and James's father are all there. James tells his readers about how he got a chance to change his life thanks to his best friend Bob, as well as to the support of the few people who believed in him. When James and Bob are giving out autographs, they're approached by the real James Bowen, the one who actually lived this story. Next, the voiceover tells us that the book, A Street Cat Named Bob, came out in 2012 and became a bestseller. James and Bob moved out of social housing into their own home and started raising funds for homeless animals and people. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so as not to miss new episodes and stay in the loop of new releases.